And so what I want to talk about today, and indeed the title of the talk is not at all misleading. It is an argument about why China should democratize, and frankly, sooner rather than later. And I want to just lay out from the outset that this argument is in part normative, in the sense that I myself believe very strongly in democracy. I myself believe in the rights that are afforded in a democracy. I myself believe that for China to continue to transform in positive ways requires democracy. So I don't want to make any bones about it. It is a normative argument that I'm making here. This is not one I would say in China. But it's also a strategic argument, and this is what I do stress when I'm in China, that it actually makes good sense for China to democratize sooner rather than later. And very specifically, it makes very good sense for the Chinese Communist Party, the authoritarian ruling party, to democratize sooner rather than later. So let me just put some context around some of the comments I'm going to make today. The conventional wisdom around the prospects of democratization, the conventional wisdom is that democracy rises from the ashes of authoritarian collapse. Right? That's typically how we see democracy emerging in many countries around the world, is in the wake of or from the ashes of an authoritarian collapse. And as my colleague Wenfeng Tang says in American Affairs, in fact he writes, ever since the domino collapse of communist regimes in the Soviet bloc in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the world has been waiting for China to follow suit. No one can be sure about how long the Chinese regime will last, but it shows no sign of collapsing anytime soon. And the point I want to stress here again is the reference to the collapse of the communist regimes of the Soviet bloc in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Because again, the conventional wisdom is that democracy, if it's ever to arise in China, if it's ever to emerge in China, will come when the Chinese Communist Party and the regime collapses. The conventional wisdom in terms of our theories of democratization privileges the notion that democracy will come when there is a legitimacy gap, when the regime, the ruling authoritarian regime, is no longer seen as legitimate by the people it seeks to govern. We predict oftentimes that in times of crises, that within the regime there's going to be a split, that there's an internal crisis within the ruling party as well, and that there are hardliners that want to stick to a dictatorial means of governance, and that there is the emergence of softliners, or a more reformist faction. And it's the conflict of softliners and hardliners in the midst of this crisis that we see democracy emerge. And indeed, the conventional wisdom is that the regime should collapse. And when the regime collapses and can simply no longer hold on, that's when we should expect democracy to emerge. In other words, the conventional wisdom around democratization and the prospects of democracy is that democracy emerges during bad times. When we see bad times is when we should expect democracy to emerge. And indeed, as Professor Tang said, we've been waiting since the 1980s and early 1990s for these bad times to emerge in China. The argument that I want to suggest to you, and it's an argument that I've been developing with my colleague Dan Slater, who's at the University of Chicago, we argue that democracy can in fact emerge when the ruling party is still legitimate. Right? So contrary to the conventional wisdom that democracy only emerges when there is a legitimacy crisis, we want to argue that democracy can emerge when the authoritarian ruling party is still legitimate, is still popular. We argue that democracy can emerge when there is no internal crisis between softliners and hardliners. In fact, we want to make the argument that democracy can emerge when the regime is not about to collapse, or when the regime has already collapsed. In fact, we want to make the argument that democracy can emerge when the regime is stable. In other words, contrary to conventional wisdom, the argument we want to make is that democracy does not only emerge during bad times, but democracy can emerge during good times. And we captured this argument in an article we wrote in the flagship political science journal for our discipline, Perspectives on Politics. This was about 5 years ago. And we call the article Democracy Through Strength, not democracy through weakness. And indeed, this is a book project that we've been now working on for the last 5 years. One of the things that we wanted to stress to our editor, however, was that we did not, contrary to his hope that we would write a blockbuster book on democracy in China, we wanted to stress to our editor that it was not our intention to write a book about China. This was not going to be a book about China, even though we probably sell a lot of copies. But rather what we wanted to do is we wanted to have a chapter in the book on China, but not have the whole book focus on China. And so one of the subtitles, or one of the ways in which we can think about this talk, is that it's not only about why China should democratize sooner rather than later, but also lessons from its democratic neighbors in Asia. And we want to draw on, actually, a lot of evidence and a lot of narrative analysis of what's going on in China's democratic neighbors to make the case that, indeed, China should democratize sooner rather than later. The chapter on China, which is still in draft form, basically asks the question, will China democratize? And there are many instances throughout Chinese modern history, in the post-dynastic era, in which we may have expected China to democratize. In 1912, for instance, we see the end, or 1911, we see the end of the Qing dynasty, we see the emergence of a republican China, and there was some thought during the 19-teens that China might democratize. The major figures and thinkers at that time in China were thinking about how to modernize China. They were heavily influenced by American political philosophy. They're heavily influenced by the norms of market economics, of science, of political democracy. Of course, we see that that doesn't happen. And we see the Chinese Civil War, and of course, the proclamation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. We also expected maybe in the late 1970s, during the democracy wall movement, that this was another moment in which China might democratize. And there was a lot of optimism around the world that this may be the time, in the wake of Mao's death, at the end of the Cultural Revolution, that this was an opening in which China would democratize. And this is a photo actually from the 1978 democracy wall movement, when protesters, not unlike the Lenin walls that we see today in Hong Kong, were basically writing tracts and treaties around the imperative for political reform in China. That doesn't happen as well with the emergence of Deng Xiaoping in 1979 and the economic modernization of China without political modernization. And indeed, in 1989, the world watched with bated breath and with great anticipation that as the students mobilized in Tiananmen Square, and when we saw protests erupt around the entire country, bringing together middle-class activists, bringing together workers, and at the forefront, students, we also saw with some optimism that perhaps China would democratize there. And of course, we know what happens. The People's Liberation Army is called in, and the Communist Party regime decides to stamp out China. So there have been many, stamp out democracy. So there have been many instances throughout China's modern history over the last 100 years where we thought we might see the emergence of democracy, and in all cases we saw no emergence of democracy at all. So the question we ask in the chapter that we're writing in this book is, well then, under what conditions should we expect China to democratize? And this is one of the ways, this is how we formulate questions in political science, is looking at the conditional variables and factors that may contribute to the democratization of China. One view of China, of the prospects of democratization in China, is forwarded by my colleague David Shambaugh, who's at George Washington University in DC, and his view is not an uncommon view. As he says here, the end game of Chinese communist rule has now begun, I believe, and it has progressed further than many think. President Xi exudes conviction and personal confidence, but this hard personality belies a party and political system that is extremely fragile on the inside. And the title of this editorial that he, or this op-ed that he wrote in the Washington Post was "The Coming Crack-Up of the Chinese Communist Regime." So it was a play on the words of the crackdown. This was the crack-up of the regime. Indeed, as I say, Shambaugh's view is not an uncommon view. There are a whole school of China watchers out there mainly in the West, who are looking for signs of a coming collapse of China. In fact, there are books called, one by David Chang, The Coming Collapse of China. And the argument here is basically that when you peel away the veneer of what seems to be a very strong regime and a very resilient Chinese polity and political economy, what we actually see is a very fragile system, and that the system is on the verge of collapse. And therefore, again, adhering to the conventional wisdom and conventional theories of transition, we should expect, with the collapse, or the coming collapse of China, the heightened prospects of democratic transition. So again, crisis, collapse, democracy in China. There's another view that's put forward, and I think most stridently captured by Daniel Bell, who actually is a Canadian professor of Chinese philosophy, and he teaches at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's one of the most accomplished political theorists and scholars of Chinese political philosophy. And he wrote in 2015 a book called The China Model. And he writes, China's single-party state structure didn't collapse. This was in the wake of the expectations that it would. If anything, it has seemed to strengthen since the early 1990s. And now liberal democracy seems to be further off than ever. And when he refers to the early 1990s, what he's referring to is the economic takeoff that China experiences after 1992, beginning in 1993. And if you look at China's economic growth patterns, there was a bit of stagnation in the early 1990s. And then after 1993, with the privatization of some firms and so on, China's economy really takes off again. And is the bedrock of the economic giant that China is today. What Daniel is arguing is essentially that the Chinese Communist Party, much to the chagrin of the David Shabaws of the world, is in fact a very strong party. It's an extremely resilient party. It's a legitimate party. It's a popular party. It's a popular regime. And therefore, there is no coming crisis. There is no impending collapse. In the absence of any collapse and crisis scenario, there is no coming democracy. And the logic that folks like Daniel Bell make is that there's no need to democratize. Right? Because again, the argument is, or the conventional wisdom is that democracy only comes after the regime has collapsed and there's no other choice. You have to democratize at that point. What Daniel Bell is arguing is that there is no need to democratize in China. The regime remains very strong. The key point here, and this is what Dan Slater and I are focusing on, is that the entire debate around democratic prospects in China, or the expectation of democracy in China, hinges on crisis. If there's a crisis, then we'll see democracy. If there's no crisis, then we won't see democracy. And I really believe that this is the wrong question to ask. Right? On one level, it's the wrong question to ask because for those of us out there who are hoping for democracy to emerge in China, the last thing we should be doing is hoping for a collapsed China. It'd be terrible for Chinese people. 1.4 billion people experience a collapsed economy is not good for Chinese people, frankly, is not good for the world. So in a strange way, there's this kind of perverse consequence of the crisis scenario is that the only way in which China will implement a more humane political system is for it to experience the most inhumane kinds of crisis. It's also the wrong question to ask because it assumes the conventional wisdom, that is to say, democracy emerges from the ashes of crisis. It assumes the conventional wisdom is the only pathway to democracy. And this we want to steadfastly argue against. And what our book puts forward is a logic, an argument that is empirically based, is an alternative pathway of democracy. And at the core of our argument is that democratization comes about in a country because of choice. People choose to democratize. It's not as though night you go to bed and you live in an autocracy, and then overnight something happens and the next morning it's a democracy, right? It's not as though one night you're a dictator and the next morning you're now a democrat. It isn't just a kind of structural, automatic event that leads to democratization, but rather democracy is based on choice. You have to choose democracy. And that's what our argument hinges on. And therefore, what we focus on are democratic possibilities. The conventional wisdom, again, is that democracy only comes about with crisis and when the ruling regime is weak. But in our argument, we suggest that democracy can also come about when the regime is strong, when it's not weak. And indeed, that autocrats can choose to democratize when the regime is strong and not weak. So the two questions that guide our book are basically, first, why do some authoritarian regimes choose democracy rather than surrender to democracy and no other alternatives? And secondly, why do some autocrats or authoritarian regimes choose democracy when they do? And so why do some dictators choose democracy? And why do dictators choose democracy when they do? And this seems like a counterintuitive argument to make. It seems like a counterintuitive set of questions to ask, because it is counterintuitive. When you look around, the modal pathway for democratization is indeed that democracy comes from the ashes of crisis. We look at the Arab Spring, for instance. We look at the color revolutions. We look at these bottom-up, ground-swelling opposition movements to regimes, and that's where we look for clues for democratic transition to occur. That's the intuition that we are basing our theories on. And China, frankly, is no different. Beijing, for instance, is deeply averse to concessions or political concessions that could diffuse the protests of the 2010s, out of fear that the least sign of compromise would embolden other challenges across China. In other words, for the regime to concede or choose democratic reform has to be a reflection of its weakness. If it's strong, it's not going to make any concessions. It's not going to concede democracy. It's not going to concede more political openness. And as we've seen, the Chinese Communist Party is not weak. But again, this is not the only way in which democracy emerges. There is a choice. And the regime can choose to democratize during non-crisis situations. A regime can choose to democratize when the ruling party is still strong. It can choose to democratize when it's in a position of strength, not weakness. When it's in a position of confidence, not existential crisis. And in fact, and this is the linchpin of our argument, conceding democracy is not conceding weakness and defeat. In fact, if you concede democracy when you're strong, you're more likely to win in democracy. You're more likely to thrive in democracy. And indeed, you're not at all likely to die with democracy. And that's the punchline of our argument, is that when you concede, when you're strong, you're actually more likely to thrive. Our theory hinges on a very important insight that UCLA political scientist Barbara Geddes once made, in which she writes, "The preferences of party cadres are much simpler than those of military officers," and she's here talking about military coups. Like democratic politicians, party cadres, even authoritarian party cadres, simply want to hold office. So in our political science models, when we're trying to understand how political decision makers make the decisions they make, what we model is the core preference for all political leaders and all party cadres, irrespective of whether they're in a dictatorship or in a democracy, is that they want to stay in power. It's not how they stay in power. It's not necessarily to be authoritarian. What they want most of all is to stay in power. And that's the key. Conceding democracy from strength is actually a way of staying in power. Democratizing when the regime is strong and implementing free and fair elections and making democratic concessions is ironically not the death knell of a regime, but rather a way for the regime to stay in power and to stay strong. The story of Indonesia's democratization, I think, is very instructive here. And it's instructive because it demonstrates the logic of our argument, i.e. democracy through strength, but it's also our weakest case. Whenever you want to make the argument and you want to make your argument as strong as possible, you go to the weakest case first to see if that weakest case actually holds. And we want to say that it does. So if you go back to 1998, it was 1 year after the Asian financial crisis. Indonesia's hit really hard, right? The economy takes a huge tumble, and the then autocrat, President Suharto, is overthrown. And the ruling party that he governs with, the Golkar Party, looks like it's on its deathbed. In comes a caretaker president, President Habibie. Not a very popular person. He is by every measure a weak president. In other words, the regime in 1998 is hanging on by a thread. Now, conventional wisdom would tell us that when a regime is hanging on by a thread, that authoritarian regime will repress. Because again, according to Getty's theory, they just want to stay in power. So if your regime is weak, how do you stay in power? You repress. But rather than repress, something really interesting happens in 1998 under President Habibie. Rather than repress, he actually expedites elections. Elections were to be held in 2002. He actually fast forwards the elections and holds them in 1999. Now, our argument is that, yes, Habibie himself as a president was weak, but the party, the Golkar Party, was still strong. In other words, he expedited elections. He ushered in democracy, not to kill his regime, but to actually increase the chances that his regime might survive. If they had waited until 2002, it is very likely that Golkar would have been destroyed. But by expediting elections to 1999, the party still has a chance. After all, this was the ruling party that presided over Indonesia's economic miracle. This was the ruling party that could say to voters, yes, we led us into the mess that is the Asian financial crisis, but we also were responsible for growing the economy at 8 to 9% a year over the last 20 years. This is still the ruling party that has clientelistic networks all over the entire country and therefore has a network or a political machinery that it can call upon during elections. This is the only national party that actually has a presence across the entire Indonesian country. In other words, by holding the elections in 1999 instead of 2002, this was the best chance for the regime to survive. This was the best option for the ruling party. And indeed, the Golkar Party came in second. And in 2004, it gained the largest seat share in the democratic legislature of Indonesia. The point we want to make here is that even in a weak case like Indonesia, even in a case where the regime is relatively weak, its best options was to still usher in democracy. Because it had enough strength, it had enough residual strength that it could survive the transition. So again, it's a very counterintuitive argument we're making here. Bring in democracy, not to die, but bring in democracy so you can survive. In our book, we even extend this argument to the case of Japan. The conventional wisdom about Japan is that democracy was imposed in Japan. After all, this was a fascist Japanese regime in the 1930s. This was the Japanese regime that attacked Pearl Harbor. This was the Japanese regime that allied itself with the fascist regime in the European theater. This was the regime that killed democracy during the 1930s in Japan. And so the conventional wisdom is that MacArthur, General MacArthur arrives in Japan in a triumphal moment in 1945 and imposes democracy on Japan. That there was really no agency in Japan at all, but rather what we see in Japan is a politically prostrate political elite, and the Americans using their military might and their post-war moral suasion and turn these fascists into Democrats. And we want to argue that actually, despite the convenience of the American triumphal story that this may convey, this isn't the full story of how democracy actually emerges in Japan. And we go back and we look at many of the historical documents during the period of 1945 to 1947. One of the interesting stories that comes out in 1946 is that General MacArthur actually turns to his Japanese counterparts and says, "You draft the first constitution." Right? The story we know is that the Constitution in Japan was the one drafted by the Americans. The Americans drafted the peace constitution. Actually, before that, in 1946, General MacArthur says to the Japanese conservative elite, "You draft the Constitution, and let's see what you come up with." The Constitution they came up with was basically the same Constitution they had in the pre-war period, a fascist authoritarian constitution. These were not Democrats turned overnight. These were not Japanese conservative elites that were suddenly transformed into Democrats. When given the choice to write their own constitution, they basically wrote the same authoritarian fascist constitution that they had before. And it was at this point that MacArthur said, "Forget it, we're going to draft our own constitution and we're going to impose it upon you." But I bring up that little story just to convey that this was not a politically prostrate elite. This was not a Japan that was supine and just simply saying, "Fine, impose democracy upon us." There was still a very authoritarian streak that was very much alive and well in Japan's political elite. So the question we ask is, why does Japan democratize? And the argument we make is that yes, there was a force of American imposition, but it also became very clear to Japan's conservative elite that democracy actually served them well, that they could win in democracy, that if they made concessions to democracy, that in fact the conservatives, or at least the ruling elite at the time, would do well in democracy. This was especially after 1947. If you're a history buff and you remember, what happened in 1947 is American foreign policy changes. It's what we call the reverse course policy. This is when the United States now, fending off communist expansion in the Asian theater, changes its foreign policy from one of democracy promotion to communist containment. What does that mean in Japan? What it means in Japan is that the Americans basically destroy the political opposition. The Americans basically undermine labor unions. The Americans basically help revive the old conservative economic elite in Japan and basically gift to the Japanese incumbent regime a democracy in which they would win. In other words, democracy made sense for the incumbent regime because it was a political system in which they would be successful. The best case we have to demonstrate this logic actually is in Taiwan. But I want to take you back to the 1980s. In the 1980s, the ruling regime, the ruling party was the Kuomintang Party, or the KMT. The KMT in the 1980s was a brutal, brutal regime. Right? We think the authoritarian regime in the People's Republic of China is brutal. The authoritarian regime in Taiwan in the 1980s, the KMT regime, was brutal. In fact, in the early 1980s, this regime was still ordering the assassination of political dissident leaders, even in the United States. So this was an unabashedly dictatorial regime in the 1980s. In 1986, a group of opposition activists proclaimed, illegally, because Taiwan was under martial law at the time, proclaimed the formation of the Democratic Progressive Party. It was in the Grand Hotel in Taipei. A group of very courageous opposition activists stood up, held a press conference, and said, "We are forming an opposition political party called the DPP, or the Democratic Progressive Party. Again, I can't stress enough how this was illegal at the time. Everyone expected the KMT regime to repress this budding opposition movement. And frankly, it would have been very easy. But what actually happened? After the formation of this opposition political party, the regime does nothing. It lets this opposition party survive. Moreover, in 1987, the regime, for the first time since 1949, lifts martial law. And in 1989, has its first free and fair election. And in 1992, has its first legislative elections. And 10 years later, in 1996, has its first free and fair presidential election. Now again, I can't stress enough, this was a brutal regime, and a strange thing happens. It allows the opposition to form, and it allows elections to occur. In other words, it initiates democratic transition in Taiwan. And in 1986, Jiang Jingguo, who was the president of Taiwan at the time, Jiang Jingguo was the son of Chiang Kai-shek, who, if you follow Chinese history, was himself a very brutal dictator and fought the Chinese Civil War against the Chinese Communist Party. Jiang Jingguo, who was president of Taiwan at the time, was interviewed by the Washington Post, and he said, "The times are changing, the environment is changing, the tide is also changing." In other words, the KMT, the dictatorial KMT, concedes democracy. And again, it didn't have to concede democracy. The party was still very powerful. It continued to have all the levers of repression at its disposal. The economy was growing at 10% a year. This was not an economy on the brink of crisis. This was an economy that was growing. It was good times. The KMT remained very popular. There were limited elections in Taiwan. No opposition parties were allowed to run in these limited elections in the 1970s and 1980s, but they had these sort of fake elections, but it was a good way for the KMT to gauge popular opinion. And the KMT swept all those elections. It was still very popular. It had presided over an extraordinary economic miracle in Taiwan. And it didn't have to concede in 1986 because this opposition was basically 12 people standing up in a hotel. It was a weak opposition. Right? There was no threat, the KMT regime. In other words, the KMT regime, as an authoritarian regime, could have hung on. It was not in a crisis situation. Taiwan was not about to collapse. But Jiang Jingguo makes this huge gamble. He concedes democracy when we would least expect it. And history has shown us that his gamble paid off. The KMT won the 1989 elections. It won the 1992 elections. It won the presidential elections in 1996. It's never held a minority position in the legislature since democratic concessions were made. It has remained the single most powerful political party in Taiwan. And there are a lot of reasons why it was strong and confident. After all, it was the KMT that steered Taiwan's economy from being one of the poorest economies in the world to, by the 1980s, being one of the richest economies in the world. Taiwan, for purchasing power, if you hold purchasing power parity and you control for that, Taiwan is the second richest economy per capita income in Asia, behind only Singapore. Right? So the KMT was strong and it was confident because it had led Taiwan through this economic miracle. At the same time, in the 1980s, when Jiang Jingguo and the KMT concedes democracy, as I've already suggested or stressed, the economy was still growing at 8 to 10% a year. And not only that, it was growing with tremendous equity. One of the signature characteristics of Taiwan's economic development was that the distribution of income was relatively equitable. So this was amazing. When you looked at any of the statistical indicators of the distribution of income, Taiwan's distribution of income was around the same as the Scandinavian countries. So it's growing at 10% a year, and everyone is benefiting from this growth. The party itself, in terms of its organization, was tremendously powerful. It was a disciplined party. It had tremendous local strength, and it had very networked kind of political machinery. It was a party that had Taiwanized, it had brought in local ethnic Taiwanese into the party to increase its legitimacy. It was a very powerful and popular political party. It also adopted an electoral system that benefited it. Right? It adhered to a set of electoral rules that benefited the ruling party. In other words, it wasn't going to lose. And it also was a tremendously stable Taiwan at the time. In other words, the KMT concedes democracy not to lose, but to win. The KMT ultimately chose to concede democracy because the party, the KMT, was in a position not of desperation, but of strong confidence that democratic concession would ensure both the KMT's victory and the maintenance of stability. So this is not conceding democracy through weakness. This is not the emergency of democracy through crisis and collapse. This is the emergence of democracy through strength and power. Our theory, then, in terms of democracy through strength, hinges on these three characteristics. That a ruling party has to be a strong party. That it has to have antecedent strength. That it has to have amassed a strong developmental record. That it has to be popular. That it has to be seen by and large as legitimate. But that nonetheless, it's a party that is starting to receive signals that maybe on the horizon its power is beginning to wane. Maybe we start to see some protests percolating. Maybe we see or we foresee an economy slowing down in the next 10 years. Maybe we see, as in the case of Taiwan, their American superpower patron kind of turning their back on Taiwan in the 1970s. That there are signals on the horizon that this party, which is really powerful, has nonetheless passed its, what we call, apex of power, right? It's on this decline, but it's still extremely powerful. And then what we see within this party is there is a strategic debate about how do we stay in power. We're a strong party, we're a legitimate party, we're a popular party. We can foresee that maybe we've passed our apex of power. Let's engage in a strategic debate now in terms of how do we stay in power. Because again, the preference for all politicians is that they stay in power. Right? So now they start asking themselves, how do we stay in power? And part of this strategic thinking then is, and one of the choices is, maybe we concede democracy. Maybe we introduce free and fair elections. Maybe we implement or institutionalize an election commission. Maybe we loosen our grip on the media. Maybe we release political prisoners. Maybe we make decisive political reforms towards democracy. That is a set of choices, but it's a set of choices that a strong authoritarian regime might make, and it might lead to democracy. So this is a very stylized graph that we oftentimes show. We don't have it in the book, but it captures basically what we're arguing here. I've got this pointer here. In other words, it's basically like a power curve. Right? The political power that the ruling party has. And we argue that over time, as that party develops the economy, as people get richer, as the economy becomes more integrated in the global economy, the party amasses strength and power. Eventually, it hits the apex of power, and it begins its incipient decline. And we call this incipient decline in this area the bittersweet spot. And it's bitter because this is where you have to start thinking maybe we should democratize. It's sweet because you're still powerful enough and still popular enough that if you concede democracy now, you're more than likely going to win. You're more than likely going to stay in power. So that bittersweet spot is really important to calculate. It's bitter because probably not going to last forever, our authoritarian regime, but it's still sweet because if you do that concession, you're more likely to win. It is also the case, however, that sometimes regimes will miss this bittersweet spot and they'll, what we say, hurtle through the bittersweet spot and find themselves on this tail end. And frankly, when you're at this tail end and you've missed a bittersweet spot, your best option then is actually to repress. There is a paradox here. That when a ruling party enjoys substantial incoming capacity, which is a fancy way of saying power, This not only increases its ability to sustain authoritarian rule, but it can lessen its imperative to do so. That's the paradox. When you're at this position, you're still strong enough to stay authoritarian, but it may also be the case that it makes the most sense at that point to concede democracy. And that's the paradox of our theory. I suggested to you that this theory may seem counterintuitive because as we scan the news headlines today, when we're looking for the prospects of new democracies to emerge, we scour the headlines looking for crises. We're looking for the Arab Springs of the world. We're looking for the color revolutions of the world. We're looking for regimes that are about to collapse, and that's where we identify prospective democracies. That's the intuition. And as I suggested to you, our argument may seem totally counterintuitive. Like, why would a regime concede democracy when it doesn't need to? Why would a regime concede democracy when it's still strong and powerful? The fact is, when you actually look at the empirical evidence, our counterintuitive theory actually is not that counterintuitive. I've already very briefly described to you how this happened in Indonesia. I described to you how this happened in Japan, and I don't do the stories justice. I would say you read the book whenever we get it done. I've described to you how it happens in Taiwan, and I will describe to you how we might think about this in the context of China. But it's not just an Asian phenomenon. In fact, it's a global phenomenon. In 1986, there were 86 authoritarian ruling parties in the world, or 86 authoritarian regimes. Since that time, 83. Since that time, 35 remain authoritarian, and 48 have undergone political transitions. Okay, so since that time, 48 of 83 dictatorships have become democracies. Of that 48, 15 are now obsolete, but 33 of those 48 remain competitive. So it's actually not the case, when you look at the empirical evidence, that democracy only emerges when the authoritarians die. In fact, the majority of transition cases, 33 of 48, are cases where the incumbent authoritarian regime remain relevant, competitive, and indeed 18 of the 48 remain major dominant parties. So the argument I made here may seem on the face of it rather counterintuitive because, as I want to suggest to you, we've been asking the wrong question. We've been asking questions about crisis and collapse, when in fact if we turn our attention to those regimes in which we see transitions in the absence of crisis and collapse, we actually see that the modal form of transition is led by strong incumbent regimes. In our view, democratic possibility is very real in China. And in fact, as the title of this talk suggests, it's imperative that China should democratize sooner rather than later. But we make the argument that it should come now because we can make the argument that the Chinese Communist Party has passed the apex of power, that there are looming problems on the horizon, that there are intractable problems in its economic structure today, that there are protests. In fact, there are thousands of protests that occur every day in China. But we also stress that not only has the Chinese Communist Party passed its apex of power, it's in the bittersweet spot, because if democratic elections were held in China today, who could challenge the Chinese Communist Party? The CCP would win. And not only would the CCP win, China would not fall apart. In fact, in many ways, the introduction of more free and fair elections in China may actually serve to stabilize China. So the argument we want to make here is that actually China's democratic possibility is not just an abstract ideal, but from a strategic point of view, it makes the most sense for the dictatorship in Beijing to concede democracy now rather than later. We also argue that what the Chinese Communist Party is now confronted with is what Bruce Dixon calls the dictator's dilemma. The Chinese Communist Party is a party of reform. Anybody who spent time in China any time in China over the last 50 years will tell you that the China of today is vastly different than the China of 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, never mind 40 or 50 years ago. The Chinese Communist Party of today is not Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party. This is a party of reform. And it's a party of really successful reform. It's a party that has revolutionized the way in which it governs. It's a party that has overseen arguably the most remarkable economic transformation in human history. It is a regime that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's a regime in which the rule of law is increasingly institutionalized. It is a regime in which actually you can do a lot of things in China. There are a lot of freedoms in China. You can choose where you want to live, you can choose what job you want to have, you can buy a house if you can afford it. There are a lot of things you can do in China that you could never have done a generation ago. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party is the paragon. It is the epitome of a successful party of reforms. But it's a party of reform without democracy. And that's the dictator's dilemma. It has in many ways sowed the seeds of its own dissent. It has created a more demanding citizenry. By allowing Chinese people to live where they want to live, to study where they want to study, to explore different aspects of social and political life like they've never done before, creates a more demanding citizenry. I'll give you an example. The anti-corruption campaign in China right now, which is phenomenal, right? I mean, this is a party that has basically said to the world, we are going to stamp out corruption. And we're going to do it in the way in which we do everything, with an iron fist. And we're going to ferret out all of the corrupt political officials and public officials, and we're going to jail them, and we're going to clean the system up. On one hand, that is an extraordinary example of reform. On the other hand, it also exposes to all Chinese citizens the extent of the political rot in the system. That's the dictator's dilemma. The more you reform, the more you generate your own opposition and your own dissent. And so as Bruce Dixon argues, being a party of reform but without democracy is a double-edged sword. As he writes, rather than solidifying the regime's hold on power, they may instead be creating their own challenges to the ruling party. That you're not seeing a revolution driven by a revolution of current-day deprivation, but you're seeing a revolution, as Tocqueville points out, a revolution of rising expectations. People are simply going to demand more. And they're going to demand more because of the reforms that you've unleashed. So if we go back to this curve, maybe, or despite, or perhaps because of the dictator's dilemma, we argue that democracy is possible in China. In fact, it's imperative in China, sooner rather than later, because the Chinese Communist Party is extremely powerful. It's extremely popular. It has, however, passed its apex of power. It's now in the bittersweet spot. But nonetheless, it should still have victory confidence. It should be confident that if democracy were ushered in today, that it would win the elections. It should have confidence that if democracy was introduced into China today, China would be or would remain stable. And in fact, and this is the one thing we always stress to our interlocutors in China, you want to learn the lessons of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Now this is a very interesting point. When you talk to folks in the party in China, they will always say, the one lesson we learned from the collapse of the Soviet Union is that by conceding reform, the whole regime collapses. That's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid Gorbachev's glasnost in Paris because he was weak. And if we show that sign of weakness, we're going to collapse. That's the lesson they take from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The lesson we stress to them is that's actually the wrong lesson. The lesson you should take from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union is that Gorbachev concedes after they've already hurtled through the bittersweet spot. In other words, they chose to concede after their best before date. They chose to concede when they were no longer strong, when they were no longer confident, when they were no longer assured of stability. In other words, they conceded when weak. That's the lesson that should be learned from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and the lesson that should be avoided by the CCP in China is don't concede when you're weak, concede when you're strong. Democracy is still very improbable in China. Right? So folks get the argument, they see the point that we're trying to make here, but they continue to resist democratization. And there are some reasons as to why. One is that the signals are unclear. It's not clear to the regime if they really have passed the apex of power. Because there are very few signals. When you're in an authoritarian regime like that, where the press is severely constrained, when village elections are a total sham, when public opinion is derived more out of fear than true public opinion, it's not entirely clear to the regime what those signals are. It's also improbable because the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing has been really good at deflecting political blame. You'd be amazed. A lot of people in China, citizens, feel that the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing is awesome. The corruption is at the local level. And the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing has been very effective in saying, we're awesome, the problem is at the local level. And they've deflected political blame. So from the point of view of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, they're still on the rise. As long as they clean out the corruption at the local level, they're not at the apex of power. This is just a little blip, and they're going to continue to rise. It's improbable as well because part of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is to resist US pressure, or Western pressure. Conceding democracy would not only be conceding a political strategy that may actually guarantee the continued relevance and dominance of the Chinese Communist Party, it's also a way of conceding to the West. And given the ultranationalism that in many ways legitimates the regime in China today, conceding to the West, conceding to the United States, conceding to Trump's United States would be a terrible blow to the regime's legitimacy. The economy has slowed down, but the effect on the regime remains unclear. People are still getting richer. The economy is still growing. This was before the trade war. The economy before the trade war was still growing. More people were getting pulled out of poverty. So even though the economy is slowing, which we would suggest maybe you're passing the apex of power for many in the Chinese Communist Party, it's unclear whether that actually means they're past the apex of power. I suppose what's most problematic and troubling is that many within the party, and indeed many within China, actually don't know where the party is on this curve. And that's a problem. Because the concession strategy that we argue is that you have to have pretty good certainty where you are on this curve. You have to know that you were strong. You have to know that you were popular. You have to know that you've passed the apex of power. The fact that there is no clarity or certainty around where the party is extremely problematic in the Chinese context. So let me just conclude by saying that there are, in our view, three possible pathways that China may take in the next few years. One is, as I've already said, that China's democratic possibility is in fact China's democratic improbability, for all the reasons I just described. There is another pathway, which is China's outright democracy avoidance, that according to the Chinese leadership, that it remains a party of reform, but that there are still enough tricks in its bag that it can continue to reform while avoiding and actively avoiding or frustrating democratic reform. And indeed, one might say that Xi Jinping's current reform, chief among which is to lift term limits on the leadership of the party and therefore the leadership of the Politburo and therefore the leadership of China, by lifting term limits, this is an example of a party that continues to reform but one that has absolutely no interest and is actively frustrating any efforts to democratize. The third possibility is indeed that China will realize its democratic possibility and may even buy our outlandish argument that it's an imperative for China to democratize sooner rather than later. That it makes strategic sense for the ruling dictatorship to concede democracy through strength and to preemptively concede democracy before it becomes weak. The democratic possibility and indeed the democratic imperative in China may emerge because from the point of view of the ruling party, the cost of avoiding democracy any longer becomes prohibitively high, and in fact it makes the most sense for the regime to stay in power to concede democracy. That it makes strategic sense for the party to concede democracy from a position of strength and not from a position of weakness. According to Slater and Wong, that's the only way in which we're going to see democracy emerge peacefully and in a stable way